see Jesus, life's trials will seem so small. When we see Christ, one glimpse of his dear face, all sorrow will erase. So bravely run the race, till we see Christ. Sometimes the sky looks dark, with not a ray of light. We're tossed and driven on, no human help in sight. But there is one in heaven who knows our deepest care. Let Jesus solve your problems, just go to him in prayer. It will be worth it all when we see Jesus. Life's trials will seem so small when we see Christ. One glimpse of his dear face, all sorrow will erase. So bravely run the race, till we see Christ. Life's day will soon be o'er, all storms forever past. We'll cross the great divide, to glory safe at last. We'll share the joys of heaven, a harp, a home, a crown. The tempter will be banished, we'll lay our burden down. It will be worth it all when we see Jesus. Life's trials will seem so small when we see Christ. One glimpse of his dear face, all sorrow will erase. So bravely run the race, till we see Christ. One glimpse of his dear face, all sorrow will erase. So bravely run the race, till we see Christ. We see Christ.
How I long to breathe the air of heaven, where pain is gone and mercy fills the streets, to look upon the one who bled to save me, and walk with him for all eternity. There will be a day when all will bow before him. There will be a day when death will be no more, standing face to face with he who died and rose again. Holy, holy is the Lord. Every prayer we prayed in desperation, the songs of faith we sang through doubt and fear. In the end, we'll see that it was worth it when he returns to wipe away our tears. There will be a day when all will bow before him. There will be a day when death will be no more, standing face to face with he who died and rose again. Oh, beside the heroes of the faith. With one voice, 1,000 generations sing, worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Forever he shall reign, so let it be today. We shout the hymn of heaven with angels and the saints. We raise a mighty roar, glory to our God who gave us life beyond the grave. Holy, holy is the Lord, so let it be today. We shout the hymn of heaven with angels and the saints. We raise a mighty roar, glory to our God who gave us life beyond the grave. Holy, holy is the Lord. Holy, holy is the Lord. Holy, holy is the Lord.
What's my safe flight story? I see inspiration right through.
There we go. Everybody come on in. Good morning. It's good to see y'all here today. You know, when you plan something like this, you're not real sure how it's going to turn out on a Saturday morning. You notice we stayed away from a few things. We stayed away from hunting season because right now it's a lull between that and I think turkey season will probably be next. Maybe some of you who are duck hunters, that might be going on a little bit, but we kind of stayed away from deer season. That's a big thing. But it's good to have you here this morning. We are going a little bit more in the man direction this morning. We are very informal with this today. I was going to have brisket for y'all this morning, but my daughter, who is a chef, said you need to make sure that you know what you're doing before you serve that to someone else. And so I didn't get that done this week, so we're having barbecue today, and hopefully a peach cobbler if it cooks okay like I want it to in a little while. But it's good to have you here this morning. I hope that as what's on my mind is the Lord's church and the need for leadership in the church. One of the greatest needs that we have is for men to step up and lead God's people. There's a lot of ways in which you can do that. We're going to be talking about shepherding this morning. We're going to be talking about elders this morning, but that's not the only way in which you can lead in the church. And we need men that will step up and be leaders in the kingdom. Now, Josh, I'll let him tell you a little bit more about his up-to-date. I know Josh from a long time ago, okay? And I know his work that he's doing at Freed-Hardeman, but so far as the up-to-date information, you'll have to kind of bring everybody up to date on that. He was telling me he had 4 children. That kind of brought me up to date on that. I was behind on that. And I'll let him do that, tell you a little bit about what he teaches and everything at Freed-Hardeman. Job has told me some about what he's teaching, but I'll let him share that with you. I'll let you do that. Now, you can do a much better job. Okay, Josh is going to come now and start with the program. I think from the layout that it's going to be a very good day for us.
I think this mic works.
Oh, yeah. You don't need that one.
Man, guys, this is encouraging. This is great to see so many of our men coming out and thinking about leadership. I want to say, too, that this is for all ages. And I hope that if you are serving now as an elder, that this will encourage you, this will challenge you, this will edify you. If you're serving as a deacon, this will be a blessing to you as you think about that service and what you're doing as a deacon and how that involves shepherding too. And then if you are a young man, and we have some guys here who came from Freed-Hardeman, I appreciate them coming, and we have some from our congregations, I want you to know that this is some lessons that you can apply now, but also are some things that you can aspire to. And when I've taught this information before, guys in their teens and 20s, the comment that was made that I really hope you'll be able to say after today was, I never really thought of myself as being able to be an elder. I always kind of put that up as such a high thing. I didn't think that I would ever do that. But now after this, I realized that this is something that I could aspire to, that I could do, is serve in the Lord's church. And so I hope that will be the attitude you can leave with today as we think about shepherding. Now, let's begin with the word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the blessings that you've given us. Father, I pray that you'll be with our time together today. May you bless it. May we be edified and built up from encouraging one another, from studying this material, from being able to think about your church and how we best can serve it. Father, we ask all these things through Christ we pray. Amen. I want this to have a workshop feel. We are going to have quite a bit of content, but then we will have some periods of discussion, some question. It may work even for us to break into, during our discussion time, some small groups and be able to discuss some things with one another. And we have the time set of the different lessons, but we'll also be a little flexible. We'll have some breaks and allow our discussion in class to kind of determine those things. I'll make sure we have a firm time of lunch and a firm time of ending at 2 o'clock after the last lesson. So we'll make sure those are met. I've been at Freed-Hardeman for 3 years. This is my 3rd year now. I preached in Mayfield, Kentucky before that at the Seven Oaks Church of Christ. I was there about 18 years. So my background is in local work and work with the church there. It's about 250 in size. We were able to build a building during that time and just got to experience all kinds of things that you get to experience in local work. And then I preach now for the Beacon Church of Christ, which is outside of Parsons, Tennessee, and work with the church there, and also, of course, teach full-time at Freed-Hardeman. I teach leadership classes and general Bible classes like Life of Christ, Acts of the Apostles, Prison Epistles, things like that. And then I also teach preaching courses and deal with how we were to organize sermons and put together sermons. So that's kind of my background. My doctorate was in church leadership, and so a lot of the stuff that I'll be sharing comes from that background and experience. So today, we're not going to be doing some of the basic stuffs in terms of thinking about the plurality of an eldership, in terms of going over all the qualifications of an elder, in terms of thinking about the 3 titles that are given for an elder, overseer, shepherd. Those are things that I'm going to assume for the most part you have a knowledge of, and that you're studying, and that your local preacher, your local Bible classes are covering, right? And also, I want to tell you guys that, so there at Seven Oaks, and as part of my work in my DMM, I put together a class that involved 12 different lessons. And so I'm taking some of the content from that and putting that today. So there's a lot of content, so we've chosen what to focus on. And what I want to focus on is the idea of what it means to be a shepherd. And we're going to talk about our families, because I think that's a big issue, and I think it's a really big issue too as we think about aspiring for that. All right. So, and then if we're serving as an elder, it's an issue because we need to think about and consider our family too. And then we're going to think about the work. What does it mean to be a shepherd? We're going to think about vision of the local church and the work of actually shepherding, right? And we'll have some discussion around these things. And then in our closing time, we're going to talk about our equipping. So the role of the elder the eldership is to equip the saints for the work of ministry, Ephesians chapter 4. So we're going to talk about how do we equip the church, how do we delegate, and how do we multiply? How do we get more leaders? How do we encourage other people to serve in the church? So that's where we're going today. I'm going to focus on those 3 main areas, and then we'll have some discussion around that. So ancient shepherds spent hours watching over, leading, feeding, and caring for the sheep. They knew their personality, they knew their age, they knew their tendencies, they knew their health. Now, I have sheep, literal sheep. I used to have Barbados sheep, Barbados black-belly sheep. Now we have Katahdin sheep. And one thing I've learned about sheep, and having sheep for about 8-9 years now, is that sheep are very dumb. And they're strong herd animal. And sheep are constantly getting in trouble if you don't guide them. They're very fearful. Even though they will threaten you and they'll stomp their little foot at you like they're going to get you, and really they're not going to do anything. But sheep are not smart. They have to have a shepherd. Now, guys, you might not be surprised to know that I don't have any shepherds. Like, how do I shepherd my sheep? Well, we've turned shepherds into fences. Like my kids, I tried to get them to do this, but they will not stand out there for 8 hours a day watching over my sheep. Like I have 4 kids, we get worked out a rotation, but they just won't do that, right? They have other things to do. They got school, but in ancient times, they actually had no fences, but all shepherds. And they would lead their sheep, they would guide their sheep, and they would be out there with them. And as I got to thinking about that, I thought in human terms. And as we think about this today, what I want us to think about is the idea that in the church, have we turned shepherds into fences? What I mean is, as elders and as church leaders, deacons, and as ministers, preachers, we can get focused on the structure. We can get focused on the business, the organization, the overseeing. And we'll talk about how that's important today. But we build fences. And we allow these fences to do our work, the programs, and we neglect the personal. We neglect the knowledge of knowing the sheep and working with the sheep and understanding the sheep and spending time with the sheep. And so today I really want us to think about this idea, and as we focus, there's certainly, on the work lesson, we're going to talk about the work of the eldership versus the work of the individual shepherd and how all this coordinates into shepherding. But I want us to think around that idea that we don't want to be just fences, that we just create things and that does it for us. We want to be shepherds that are involved and active with the people. Now, the shepherd metaphor in Scripture is very plentiful. God is described as the shepherd. Now, we won't be able to dive into this in great detail. And by the way, I have long notes, like this lesson here is like 5-6 pages. And the PowerPoint just has the brief stuff on it. And so if you want this later, I'll get your email address and I'll email you any of this content that you might want in detail, right? Has a lot of the verses and stuff on it. But, for example, the Lord is my shepherd. Shall not want. God is described throughout as the shepherd. He is the premier shepherd of Israel. Ezekiel 34. God is the shepherd. But then, when we think about Israel had shepherds, the leaders of Israel are described as shepherds. In fact, the ancient Near Eastern most often described description of the king. I'm talking about ancient Near Eastern nations, not only Israel, but all the nations. The Hittites, the Babylonians, the Egyptians. You know what the most often used analogy for the king was? Shepherd. You go back into Egypt, and they often depicted the Egyptian Pharaoh as a shepherd. It was the most common designation for the king. It's the same in the Bible. David is described as the shepherd of the children of Israel. And he gets in trouble because he failed to poorly shepherd the children of Israel. Now, what is the king's analogy? And this analogy in ancient Near Eastern culture was such because the king was to provide food and necessities, economic growth. He was to provide protection. He was to provide care. He was to provide the sustenance for his people. And so when they thought about what we want the king to do, they thought about we want him to be our shepherd. Now, this was an agrarian-based society where shepherds were everywhere, right? And if you still go to Israel today, you'll see shepherds standing out with sheep. But in that culture, that's what everybody did. Everybody had shepherds that they took care of their sheep with or their other animals. And so when they thought about what do we want in our leaders, we want our leaders to be shepherds. Now, when we think about Jesus then, so in Ezekiel 34, which is a wonderful passage to study, the children of Israel shepherds, by the way, I believe in Ezekiel 34 that the poor shepherds there that were failing were the kings of Israel. And God says, I'm going to remove you as shepherds because you have eaten the fat of the sheep. You have not sought my sheep. You have not healed my sheep. And so God says, I'm going to have to do it myself. I'm firing you as a shepherd, and I'm replacing you. And he then prophesies in Ezekiel 34 that there's going to be David, the one shepherd who will be over my people. And that's a prophecy not about King David, but it's you. David's already lived. It's using the idea of David as a shepherd to prophesy about Ezekiel 34 is prophesying about John chapter 10. You guys are familiar with John chapter 10, where Jesus comes along and announces that he is the good shepherd that comes to give abundant life to his sheep, who lays down his life for the sheep. Now that is a direct, the people of Jesus' day knew about Ezekiel 34. And they knew that they were longing and looking for the one shepherd that Ezekiel 34 had prophesied. Jesus says, I'm here. I'm here. I'm the good shepherd. I lay down my life for the sheep. And so Jesus is described as a good shepherd. And then, of course, elders are given the title of pastors or shepherds. 1 Peter chapter 5, they are to then be the underneath, the under shepherds, under the chief shepherd who is Jesus. Now that's a brief biblical description of shepherding. But as we think about this, guys, God wants then today shepherd leaders. He wants shepherd leaders. Have you ever thought about this idea? And of course I have a lesson I do on sheep, and I tell some of my stories about my sheep. And the primary biblical description of us is sheep. I mean, you think about it, guys, that's not very flattering. No. I mean, it's like, he didn't say you're eagles. No. I have horses. Man, horses are beautiful. They're strong. They're powerful. They're sleek. I love to see our horses out in the morning, standing out there. They're just beautiful. I got this horse that's really is partial Arabian, half Arabian, half quarter horse. She is a beautiful horse. And God didn't say you guys are horses. You guys are stallions. You're strong and mighty. What did he say? He says you're sheep. You're lost. You struggle. You know what? You can't protect yourself. You get into all kinds of messes. You're sheep. You see, God described us as sheep. So what does he want? He wants shepherd leaders. He wants leaders who have compassion, who look over the sheep and have compassion to lead them, who rub shoulders with them. You remember in John 10, Jesus says, I know my sheep. He wants leaders who know their sheep. God doesn't want CEOs. He does not want boards of directors. He doesn't want politicians. He doesn't want kings. He doesn't want wealthy rulers. He doesn't want generals. He wants shepherds. He wants people that can get dirty when the sheep need to have their hooves cut, can help pull out a young lamb when it's stuck in a mess and it can't birth properly. He wants shepherds to be willing to do the dirty jobs on behalf of the sheep. He wants you to seek the sheep. He wants you to heal the sheep. He wants you to know the sheep. He wants you to rub shoulders with sheep. And He wants you to be an example to the flock of God because you're a part of the flock of God. So shepherds are the kind of leaders He wants. Now guys, I really want to say that when you think about this, the primary image throughout Scripture of a shepherd is a suffering, righteous servant. One of the things we're struggling with, and I agree with what Terry's saying, we're struggling with getting men to step up into leadership across the brotherhood. And a lot of men have and I know in the church context I was in, guys would look at the eldership and they would say, I've watched this man serve for a long time. I've seen the stress they have, and I don't want any part of it. I've even seen situations where there were sons who had watched their father, and the church is like, hey, we need you to be an elder. And they're like, no, I'm not going to do that. Now, I'm not trying to... There's times where a man knows it's not best for him to serve. But here's the thing, guys. And I really want to say this. We think about this aspiring idea of being a leader. You're stepping into a long lineage of shepherds who are called to be a suffering, righteous servant of God's people. The first shepherd, Abel, begins this analogy, and he was killed by his brother. You think about the list of shepherds, which goes throughout the Bible like this. Abraham was a premier shepherd in the Old Testament, and he's called to leave his home. You think about all the struggles and suffering that Abraham did, even being called because it was God's desire to go and sacrifice your son. Wait 25 years for this promised son, finally get him, and then God says, go kill him. Suffering, righteous shepherd. Do you want Abraham's job? Think about the next shepherd, David. One of the premier shepherds of God's people. By the way, you could talk about Jacob, who was a shepherd, right? He did a lot of shepherding. Moses, who spent 40 years. Moses says, hey, I'm ready. I'm the child of Egypt. I'm ready to redeem these people. Goes out, kills a man. God says, you're not ready. Go spend 40 years as a shepherd. Go spend 40 years in the wilderness looking at trees and sheep. Probably not trees, shrubs, right? And sheep. Once you learn how to manage sheep, then you're ready. Moses says, no, I'm not ready now. I can't speak. I can't do this. I got all these reasons why I can't do it. I'm not your man. God says, you're ready. You're the man. 40 years of suffering in the wilderness being a shepherd before he was ready to be a shepherd. Think about David. All these men go by, all the older brothers. David shows up bringing bread, bringing food. David says, I've killed a bear. I've killed a lion. I'm not letting that guy talk to my God like that. Why was David able to do that? Because he was a shepherd. He was a shepherd. And then you go on down and you think about some of the prophets. Amos being a shepherd prophet. And then you come to the New Testament. And Jesus is described as the good shepherd. Paul spends 3 years in Arabia after he becomes a Christian, before he begins all of his missionary work. The point I'm trying to say is this, guys. this is a work. It is hard. I love shepherds. I love elders. I loved working with our elders there and worked with them on a very close basis in Mayfield for years. I love working with the elders there at Beacon. And one of the things we need to emphasize to those who are serving as elders, that it is a calling that does involve suffering, righteousness, and servanthood. That is the lineage you're stepping into. But it's also a wonderful calling because you're leading God's people. I think about President Garfield, who when he was going into the office of president and discussing going into that service, said that I will step down from the highest office in the land to run and be a part of being the President of the United States. And he was leaving his service as a shepherd as an elder in the church to go and be in a political office of president. And I like what he said. I'm stepping down from the highest work, the highest office in the land. I don't want us to categorize any kind of service as higher than another in the body of Christ, but I do think that illustrates what I'm trying to say. This is a wonderful work, an incredible work, but it's one that you don't do for praise, you don't do for money, you don't do for power. You do because you are falling into a lineage of shepherds, and God wants shepherd leaders. That's His plan. And so when we think about the character of shepherds, then I want to think about family. So you could go through the qualifications, but I want to look at a few things, three qualities for our families, guys, that I really want to emphasize in the time we have on this lesson. The first one is sexual purity. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, in the qualifications, he's the husband of one wife. Now, obviously there's been a lot of discussion through the years about what that means, and we can talk about that in some of our discussion time. I believe that it's just simply saying he's a faithful man to his one wife. He's not in a polygamous marriage. He's not in an unscriptural marriage. He's in a faithful relationship with a wife. Now, when we think about this, what he's saying here is that he is sexually faithful. In 1 Timothy 3:2, it also uses the word self-controlled. And commentators point to this idea of self-controlled possibly being an allusion to the sexual arena of life. And certainly it is not limited to the sexual area of life. It certainly includes it, doesn't it? We must be self-controlled. I think about 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 1 through 8, when it talks about us knowing how to possess our own vessel and not defrauding our brother or sister in a sexual matter. Sexual temptation is always there, right? I think about the man who was talking to a young man, and the young man was talking about the sexual temptation that he was dealing with, and the older man, who was in his 40s at the time, said, "Guys, I want you to know I didn't know about sexual temptation until I got in the 40s." And what he was saying was he had dealt with sexual temptation all throughout his life, but it was even higher for him in what he was dealing with in his 40s. It is something we always have to be on guard with. And I believe it's Satan's biggest attack upon church men today. The issues of, it's so accessible, right? And it's so private. And Satan lies to us and says we can do this privately. We can do this victimless. It's not harming anybody. Through pornography, through affairs. I'll tell you a story. A friend told us, she's a preacher's wife, and told us this incredible story of her painful experience. There was an elder at her home church who was always in her life. Always in her life. In fact, he kind of served as like a surrogate father to her. He was a close family friend. And the kids grew up together. They were like always playing together. And he was a very significant and powerful leader in the church there. And she often had a strained relationship with her dad and was not well accepted by his family. Her dad was not well accepted by his family, and he was kind of always on the outside. And this man the surrogate dad actually walked her down the aisle at her wedding. And her mom and dad had divorced by this time, and so he was filling in. Years later, after only a few years before his death, when he was now very physically weak and in the nursing home, it all came out that actually this girl was his daughter. And that's why he had been so close to her and continued to be such family friends, and that's why he wanted to have so much influence over her. But he never owned up to that until very late. And he actually owned up to her in the nursing home and told her, I will tell you this, I will admit that, but if you tell anybody, I will deny it to everyone. Now, she remembers going over to an apartment and waiting in the car. When her mom would go over to an apartment, she would wait in the car or being dropped off at a grocery store while her mom visited him in his secret apartment he kept just for those things. This illicit affair between an elder and a highly respected church member went on for years, for decades. It never came out really in a very public way until he was very old and in the nursing home. She described him as a big personality. He had money and was loud in his talk. He would often boast that he was the strength of the church. Would you be surprised that both of his sons are unfaithful to the Lord this day? Guys, sexual temptation is always there. And it doesn't matter whether you have a title of a youth minister, preacher, elder, deacon, it's there. And Paul says we've got to be self-controlled. We've got to be the husband of one wife. We've got to be pure. And so, guys, when we think about family, think about purity. Number two, when we think about family, we've got to manage our own household well. 1 Timothy 3, 4, and 5. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his household, how will he care for God's church? Titus chapter 1, verse 6, his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. Guys, those of us that are raising children or have children in our home, this is a very important one. The Puritans referred to the family household as the little church. This concept underscores the scriptural reasoning that if a man cannot shepherd his family, he can't shepherd the extended family of the church. The household is the training ground for shepherding. What I want to emphasize is that we need to first give attention to our families, to shepherd our wife, shepherd our kids. And we learn about shepherding, we learn about relationships through our own families. I'm so encouraged by your presence here today because you're valuing spiritual things on a Saturday morning. As Terry mentioned, there's all kinds of other things that could be going on, but you're here. Let me encourage you to allow that also to be the principle you live by with your family. There's all kinds of things like work, hobbies, recreation, friends that can take us away from pouring into our wife and our kids. Don't neglect your family. So many men that could have served in the church as leaders, but they look back upon their child-raising years and they have such regret because their priorities were out of line during those years. And so that's one reason why I love having these young guys here and these guys that have kids here, because I want you guys to know these are the years you can capitalize on this. These are the years you've got to pour into it during those years. And so think about your family. And then number 3 on this, before we talk about some challenges, is we've got to model Christ. One of the most important roles we have as fathers is to set an example to our children. We have to live out our faith. In 1 Peter 5, verse 3, and really the overall principles of qualifications is example, right? I mean, be an example. That's what these qualifications are about, and as they go through all the different things. And in 1 Peter chapter 5, he lays this out. He says, that we are to be an example to the flock. To be an example to the flock. In verse 3, that is, they're watching you, not to lord over them. You're not a dictator. You're not in power over them per se. You're to be an example, exercising oversight. You have authority, yes, as an elder or shepherd in the church. But your leadership is going to be connected with your influence. Your influence is how you lead people. Because ultimately the flock they're all volunteers, right? They're all following your leadership because they respect you. We can talk about positional authority, and then we can talk about spiritual authority, and we can talk about expert authority, and we can talk about this idea of respect and authority that is given because of respect. And you think about an elder, a shepherd. Does he just have positional authority? He has that. He has the authority because he's an overseer, because he's a shepherd. But do people follow him because of that? They follow him because of his spiritual respect. They follow him because of his expertise. They value his wisdom, his knowledge of the Word. And they follow him because of the respect they have for the life that's been lived. He's an example. That comes from modeling Christ, right? Being an imitator of Christ. Model Christ. Now, when we think about character, guys, those are three things that we have to really consider. Now, let's take about 10 more minutes, then we'll take a break. But I want to talk about some challenges, because we'll come back to these during the discussion time. Some challenges that come in these areas. First of all, I don't want to give you 5 challenges that come. The first one is the myth of the perfect family. The myth of the perfect family. Anybody here have the perfect family? I don't see anybody standing up, because I was going to let you take over this teaching today, because I would like to learn. I like to say that there's no perfect family, and all families are dysfunctional. It's just a matter of degree. And isn't that true? It's kind of like everybody's normal until you get to know them, then they're weird. Right? You're like, well, that's kind of weird in their family. You know, kids come to Freed Harmon and then they go home with someone on the weekend. And they realize, wait a minute, I thought every family did it like my family. And they realize, no, not every family does it like your family. And it's not bad, it's just different, right? And the more we get to know people, especially when you get married, right, you realize that, oh, wow, their family did it like this. And our family did it like this. Well, there's no perfect family. And rather, we all know, and we'll talk about this some today, that there's this fishbowl complex you hear about ministers and elders in the church. And a lot of guys don't want to serve in the church because they're afraid of this reputation. And it intimidates people. And it's rightly intimidating. Well, my family's not perfect, and if I get put in that position, I'm going to be examined and scrutinized. And I think, in my own life, when I've dealt with that as a preacher and as a teacher, you impress people with your strength. You connect with people in your weaknesses. People need to see vulnerability in you. So rather than thinking about a perfect family, I would suggest thinking about real families striving to obey God. There's a quote I love that goes along this idea that people had rather follow a real leader any day than one who's always right. Now it's playing on that idea that there's no leader who's always right, but people want to see authenticity. They want to see realness. And so I would suggest understanding that that's simply a myth. And the danger is, as 2 Corinthians 10:12, is to compare ourselves constantly with others. And avoid putting crushing expectations upon your family. Don't, guys, the preacher guys up here, youth ministers, never tell your kids, your physical kids, do this because I'm a youth minister. Never tell your kids, you got to go to that youth devotional because I'm an elder. No. I'm a deacon. You got to go. No. This is who we are as a family. This is who we are as a family. Don't put crushing expectations upon your family that aren't realistic. Don't put that. Remember, Jesus was the Son of God, and He needed to hear at His baptism and at His transfiguration, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." Your kids need to hear how you love them and how you're pleased with them. So don't put expectations that you can't live up to or they can't live up to. The next challenge is talking practical here, guys. Your wife's role and the burden it puts on her. This is often very neglected. But when you think about the challenge of serving as a minister, as an elder, as a shepherd, as a deacon, and you think about this, it puts a real constraint on your wife. The expectations often are unrealistic. In churches, you know who is the most isolated and often feels the most alone of anybody in the church?
Preacher's wife.
Preacher's wife. Almost every study proves that, guys. She feels expectations, and elders' wives often feel they've got to fit a mold. I can think of several men who are not elders because their wife doesn't want that expectation. And we have to be good as churches at allowing there to be not such pressure on an expectation to fit a mold. And that mold is like, you're going to be at every shower, you're going to plan all the showers, or you're going to teach this kindergarten class for the next 20 years because you're an elder's wife. And so you need to think about, guys, and I want to say a little bit on this, you need to think about what information you tell your wife. And this just goes for us in general. But if you serve as a church leader, you need to make and discuss with your wife about confidentiality. And think about what you tell her. It's common for husbands and wives to discuss matters and for the husband to rely upon her wisdom. I think that's one of the reasons God gave us wives, right? To rely upon their wisdom. But here's some questions to ask. First of all, does she understand confidentiality? Does she understand that? And then when you think about telling her something that relates to the church, is this information I wish I did not know? And thus does she need to know it? In other words, if I wish I didn't know this, then can I spare her having to know it? Is it going to change how she looks at that person at church? Is it going to hinder her worship? Am I telling her with the hope of helping me solve, discern, or process how to handle the situation? If I'm sincerely telling her because I need her wisdom, then that's a very good reason. One thing I would often do and try to avoid doing now is I would tell her, I'd come home from an elders meeting or whatever, and I would be burdened with something, and I would tell her, and I just took that burden and I gave it to her. I woke up the next morning and I felt good. I went on my day and I was dealing with those things and I really wasn't too preoccupied with it. But you know what I did? I realized over time I had taken and left that with her. She couldn't do anything with it. She didn't really know the context of all the people. I'm working through it the next day and I still love those people, whatever. She's just left with those things in my anger, my frustration, my resentment, and then she's dealing with all that and she loves me the most, and so she's then struggling with all that. It's not fair for me, guys, to do that. As an elder, don't put all your burdens on her, because it's kind of like in-law relationships. You know, you come home and dump all that on them, and they're loving them, and they don't get. So, like in a marriage, you don't talk to your parents all bad about your wife, right? Because then all they're going to hear is the bad, and then you fall back in love with her, and y'all work that out, and y'all get along good. But you don't go back. Nobody goes back and tells their parents, "Oh, but we worked it up, and she did all these great things, and I really love her a lot." No, they're still living with all that negative you put in them, right? And that causes problems. That's why it's not good to do that. Well, that's the same in a church. If you go home and tell your wife all these things about this stuff, then all she gets is that negative. And then you move on. And so, guys, we really need to think about telling our wives. And I really believe that confidence with me, and I can trust sharing that with my wife, and we can have confidence there, right? But it's not always best to do that. If she doesn't have a need to know, then don't share with her. If she's not going to help you in wisdom, don't share with her. So I think, don't put that burden on her. We'll talk about that in discussion time. Time and stress. One of the things I hear a lot from guys who serve as elders and go into the eldership, there's a lot more time involved than I ever thought, and a lot more stress than I ever recognized. And so think about the time involved, elders meetings, visitation, and this is a stress upon the wife, upon the kids, and upon the man. Isolation. Many men feel isolated, and one of the things we're going to talk about in our discussion time, or as we think about these, is who shepherds the shepherd? Do we have times built into our meetings where we really say, how are you? You heard about one eldership. The man had a heart attack, got out of the hospital. The other men did not know it. He had like a heart episode, had gone to the hospital, got out of the hospital, made it in time for the elders meeting, sat through the whole elders meeting, and then gets out and goes to worship. And the men in the elders meeting did not even know that the man had just had all those episodes. Almost died. Because we're not vulnerable enough with one another. Another man was having troubles in his family, and his wife had breast cancer. One of his kids, who was a grown man, just had a real situation in their family. We're dealing with all these things in his own life. And then he comes into the elders meeting and he has all these church issues going on. Sometimes we just need to say, we need to shepherd one another. Like who shepherds the shepherds? Who shepherds the minister? We've got to do one another, right? And if we're not doing one another, then there's isolation, and we feel alone, and we feel like we're the only one because we can't put our burdens on one another. And so isolation is a real challenge. And finally, your children. When you think about this issue of your children, there's often an expectation and social stigma which is placed upon them. You know why all the preacher's kids get in trouble, don't you? Playing with the elders' kids. Right, all the other church kids can treat or speak to the church leader kids, but the church kids are treated differently. I got a story real quick on this. When Austin, my son who's 19 now, was growing up, he was born at the congregation, so he was there the whole time. And he was like in 3rd or 4th grade. And they were talking about things in Bible class one time, and the teacher told us the story. She was asked him, she said, Austin, what's it like being the preacher's kid? And they were talking about preachers and things. And Austin, as a little kid, thought, And he replied, he said, I've never really thought about that. I don't feel like a preacher's kid. That's what he told his class. And he did not, like the church treated him like that. He grew up not thinking anything about being a preacher's kid. What was tough is, as he went through his junior high years and high school years, it changed drastically. As he had to deal with some jealousy, as he had to deal with unrealistic expectations and things because he was the preacher's kid. And here's the thing, how do you handle that as a shepherd? How do you handle that with your own kids? Do you let them be held to a higher level just because they're your kid? It discourages a lot of kids. And it's one reason why I would suggest that if you have young children, teenage children, you need to really think about, do I want to become a shepherd now? Or do I want to wait a few years? I knew a man one time who said he had been asked several times to become an elder. And he said, I want to do that, but I've got 3 or 4 more years before my child graduates high school. As soon as she graduates, I will do it. But I want to give my attention and I want to give the pressure off my child until she's gone. And he said he looked back upon that and he said he said even though the church needed me and I think I could have served then, he said I think that was by far the best thing for my family. And so think about your kids. And I'm not saying don't serve. I'm saying think about when you're serving and even after you're serving, the expectation that gets put on them because you're a shepherd or as a deacon. I want to I want to stop there and before we go to our next lesson and take a little break. Guys, think about any questions you have. Think about any questions, and during our question and answer discussion time, we will just talk about these things, all right? So we're trying to get a lot of content out there on the table, and then we'll discuss them, all right? So let's take a 5-minute break. Let's come back. It's 10:18 now. Let's start back at 10:25. Can we do that? 10:25? All right, can you pull up that PowerPoint? Well, guys, we're going to transition to thinking about work for a little bit and what it is involved in shepherding. So Harold's lip was quivering slightly as he wrung his napkin and was over a meal, and he wore a gracious attempt at a smile, but his eyes revealed weariness and a bit of pain. When he said, shepherding is a beautiful idea, and it looks to me like God wants me to be a leader like that, but how do I do it? How do I do it? And then he said, I'm in the real world and I'm so busy, and he was still working at the time, and he said, like this week, I've been traveling. I was over in this state, and then I flew back home, and now I had to go to this other job site, and how do I connect all these things with my work and my family, and how do I find time to shepherd in the 21st century? Well, that's a real challenge, guys, and it's one of the reasons why I believe that we should not have a Lone Ranger shepherd complex, right? We're doing this in a group of other men. We're also doing this with deacons. We're also doing this with our family. We're also doing this with the church members, right? And so we should not think we're just alone. Now, think about this diagram here. I want you to consider this for a minute. So there's two broad categories of shepherding as I want us to think about them today. There's what I call the collective or macro large, which is what we might call the eldership, and I believe the Bible would teach that the authority lies within the eldership, right? Not in an individual elder, but rather in the eldership as a whole, because the plurality of the eldership. But then there's the individual or micro shepherding. That is what the elder or shepherd does as an individual. What I would encourage you to think about is that when we think about, once again, that we want to not be fences, we want to be shepherds, is that we have to think about both of these categories, all right? And that when we think about aspiring to this, we need to understand that our shepherding is going to involve both. Now, we can think about the duties of a shepherd along the lines of knowing. He's supposed to know the flock. The Bible talks about feed the flock, Acts 20:28. He's supposed to lead the flock, and he's supposed to protect the flock, right? Protect the flock. So we think about knowing, feeding, leading, protecting. Now, look on our diagram here, and you'll see that underneath macro is knowing. You've got to know the church's strengths, weaknesses, membership issues. Feeding, you've got to think about preaching, Bible school, worship, special seminars. Leading, vision, ministries, purpose, budget. And then protecting, making sure that you control the culture, the discipline, doctrine, administration, any of those kind of things. So all this falls under the larger group. Now, when we think about individual shepherding, we think about knowing there's personal relationship, there's regular contact, maybe there's a group of sheep that you really, as the eldership has maybe divided that out, you're going to make sure you know the sheep, you're connected with them personally. There's feeding, you're going to have one-on-one discipleship, mentoring, admonishing, working with deacons, things like that. Personal, example, family, coaching, staff, deacons, ministry leaders. So you're involved in that. And then finally, protecting, admonishing, warning with an individual basis, right? Dealing with marriage issues, all that kind of stuff, counseling, and that. Now, I've got a couple questions here for you guys, and I want us to talk about these now. Which of the categories is most important? Which one do you think is most important? Can't have one without the other? That there's really macro and micro are both equally important? All right? Now, raise your hand if you're a present shepherd or elder. All right. So guys, here's what I want you guys to ask or answer. Which do you feel demands or receives the most of your time? Macro or micro? See. You think the individual time, working with individuals, does the most?
Well, that receives more money. We don't have as much as meeting together, working together as we do. Okay, we've done that, here we go, let's go, kind of thing. So as far as time-wise, It's more on my own.
All right. What about these two brothers back here?
The micro, for sure.
Micro?
As far as, takes more time. Takes more of our time.
Mhm.
Should take more of our time.
Mm-hmm.
And we work together. I think the macro is the more difficult thing to deal with. It may not take as much of our time, but it is, to me, the more demanding.
All right, that's a great way to look at it. Well, next question is, why do you think it is more difficult?
Don't answer me. Honestly, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. No. Well, and I think,
Outside influence.
all right, outside influence, and you're working with others, right? You're working with others in terms of the eldership, moving things forward. All right, somebody else. Maybe a couple guys over here raise their hand. What do y'all think?
Well, I've only been an elder for a short time, but so far I think the macro has dominated our time spent. But my focus is trying to work on the individual, because I don't personally think we're doing a good enough job in that area yet. So, you know, the macro is you're gonna have to handle. You're gonna have to have a budget. You're gonna have to do things like that. And they're gonna come. And you know, if you don't, you've got major issues. But you know, the macro dealing with individuals and stuff. I mean, that stuff can blow up on you at any minute. So you gotta spend the time there and try to help people.
So in some ways, this often is more organized, more controlled, more pressing. And guys, I want to be clear in my judgment. Neither one of these are more important than the other, right? Both of these are important. And one thing I want to emphasize is both of these are shepherding. Time spent in elders' meetings, and I know sometimes that gets a bad press. Well, elders' meetings, you know, we just meet. But if elders meet, they're necessary, right? And that's shepherding too, as you were mentioning there. You know, you've got to do those things. You've got to have organization. You've got to have budgets. You've got to have, you know, those discussions. And so that is shepherding too. So both of these are shepherding. Sometimes I think we want to say, well, this bottom category, when I was out at the hospital this past week ministering with this family, or when I was over there talking to, they called me and they were having a marriage problem, a young couple did, and a couple of our elders went over and met with them. That was shepherding. Well, it is. But also sitting in the meeting and talking about what we're going to do this next year and how we're going to do that, that's shepherding too, right? And so we don't need to prioritize one over the other, but here's the point. We don't need to neglect either one, and I think that's the struggle, is that we can tend to go to one side or the other because of our strengths, the strengths of us individually, the strengths of us as an eldership, and we can tend to neglect the other.
Oh, there's a proverb, I don't know where the passage is, but it says, it's iron sharpens iron, man sharpens man. Mm-hmm. And I would think that in their work together in the macro, that's where they can sharpen each other and make sure my thinking is going the right direction as we work together. We bounce ideas off each other. I think that would be so important.
And if you're thinking as a deacon, if you're a deacon or if you're a church member, then you need to realize that this is going on in a church. And so your role as a deacon, for example, is going to be to assist and make sure that you're doing whatever you can in your role to help the elders be able to be advantageous in doing their roles, right? So if the deacons are doing their job, this becomes a lot easier, right? Ideally, and one of the things, this is not a deacon seminar, but the role of the deacons is to take the day-to-day task and the ministries of the church off of the eldership so the eldership can do the big vision stuff and the daily shepherding, right? The elders can shepherd, deacons can do the ministry. That's the goal. And so if they've delegated this out, that's our third lesson of the day, delegation and multiplication. If a lot of this has been delegated out, and then they have given the authority to the men or leaders in the church to do that, they still have the responsibility, the elders do, but they've given the authority to do that, then that allows them to oversee this, but then still be able to do this on a personal basis as needed. Now, that's all ideal. Someone else, let me ask those of us who are not elders, which category seems the most intimidating or daunting to you? Someone want to comment to that?
As someone who gets to work closely with elders, the macro side of it is very like others have said, it dominates the majority of the time. But the elders that I get to work with do a really good job working the micro to affect the macro. Does that make sense?
That's a good point. Yeah.
And so while as a minister that can be frustrating because you want to see things that you're requesting or that you're wanting to do get done, immediately. They take the time in working through the macro to think about, okay, how will this affect the relationships that we've built, and how will this, what is going to be the reaction of the congregation if we implement what you're wanting to do, what you're talking about, how this is going to work. And so, at face value, looking at that as a minister, I'm like, man, can't we just do, but at the same time, I've been in the work that I'm doing now for going on 6 years, and in that time I've come to appreciate the fact that sometimes we move slower because they know their sheep better than I do.
That's right. That's right. And then the micro is able then to feed into the macro, and we've all heard, and we're all afraid of the idea of elders just operating as a board of directors who are disconnected. And we've seen that in churches that are disconnected from the church, and they just kind of legislate for the church. And this kind of model is going to prevent that, right? This kind of model is going to prevent that idea so that you can be connected. Talk about establishing the vision then. So, talk about vision. So one of the key ideas I want to emphasize in the work, so we're going back. So we're going to talk about this component right here is where we're going to zone in for a little bit. And then we're going to talk about this component in the time we have. So vision. You've heard of these vision statements like love God, place for everyone. We exist to connect people to each other. Love God, love church. That kind of thing. What I'm saying is that's not what I'm focused on. Like everybody's got that. I mean, we know that, right? So when we think about our vision, I'm not just saying put up a vision statement that says loving God and loving others and have that, pasted up here. That was really big in the 90s. Purpose-driven church came out and kind of that emphasis. And really we know that, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. I call it the two greats, the Great Commission and the Great Commandment, right? We're supposed to love one another and we're supposed to go out and spread the gospel. But what I'm talking about in terms of your church is what are we doing here? So shepherds have the unique and vital job of setting the congregational vision. They point the direction. They're saying this is where we're going to go. This is how we're going to do the Great Commission. This is how we're going to do the Great Commandment, right? That's the elder's job. In fact, articulating the vision may be the leader's single most important responsibility. The leader keeps the vision, the mission, the reason the church or organization was formed before the people, continually asking what we need to do today and tomorrow to live out that vision. You guys are aware that there is always mission or vision drift. That most organizations are moving away from the reason they were started. And that just happens. Like Harvard and Princeton were all started as, quote, Christian universities when they started, but they've moved way away from that, right? We've seen that in a lot of places, right? They move away from the mission. And sometimes that's necessary. For example, Blockbuster Video was not able to change their mission or vision, and so you don't see Blockbuster Videos everywhere anymore. So if you're going to be successful, you've got to manage this, but you got to keep your mission. I think about Habitat for Humanity. Habitat for Humanity a few years ago was focused primarily on their mission was to provide housing for people that need it, right? That's the mission, provide housing for people that need it. But for years they were doing that through building houses. But they only were able to serve a very limited population group in building houses because it's a very high cost and a lot of work to build a house, right? But now they've changed. They still build houses, but they also work a lot in financing. They work a lot throughout all the world in apartments. They have all kinds of ways of providing housing that's not just building a house. In fact, they have gone from like serving a few 100,000 to serving like 15 million in like a 15-year period. How have they done that? Because they're still trying to focus on providing housing for the needed, but they changed how they do it. That's what I'm talking about. We have the Great Commission and the Great Commandment, but the elders' job is to figure out how we're going to do that today. How we're going to do that today. And to get the people on board with doing that. Now, we were talking out here in the foyer about how so many churches can turn into maintenance mode and museum mode, where they're looking at the past. We used to do all these things, and we just want to maintain. And we lose the movement. We're a movement, and we are a mission. We're focused on a mission. And the elder's job is to keep them focused on the mission. If you turn to Ephesians chapter 4, we're going to be there a lot this afternoon in our third lesson, but in Ephesians chapter 4, 11 and following, God gave the church, Jesus in His resurrection gave gifts to the church. What's the gift He gave the church? Verse 11. He gave the apostles, prophets, evangelists, and shepherds and teachers. He gave gifts to the church. Why? To equip the saints for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ, until we all attain. Notice that the gift of leadership is to equip the saints for doing the work of ministry. Their job is to organize the saints and to focus them on doing the work of ministry. They choose where to do the work of ministry. Now in Philippians chapter 3, 12 through 15, not that I've already obtained, or I'm already perfect, but I press on to make it my own, because Christ Jesus has made me His own. Brothers, I do not consider that I have made it my own, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Vision is the ability of leadership to see beyond and not be bound by existing horizons. Vision enables the leadership to conceptualize what the organization could be, where it could go, and what it could do. We have to think about, what do we want in this congregation? Where are we going? The church follows its leaders. The essential thing that elders must do, I love this quote, that members cannot do. What's the one thing that the deacons can't do, the preacher can't do? And it's a problem if the preacher gets into this, right? He needs to be a part of this, but he can't do this. The deacons can't do it, and that's a problem if a group of young families get into this, and they're trying to push this, and the elders aren't behind it. The elders are the only one who have this sole responsibility, and that is, they are to set the direction of the church. This is where we're going. This is what we're going to do. Most churches are willing to follow their leadership if they just know where they're going. They just want to know where they're going. In other words, we want to do mission work. All right, elders, tell us where we're going to do mission work at. We're focused on we're going to have a Bible school program. All right, tell us how we're going to do a Bible school program. We're going to do evangelism to our community. All right, there's all kinds of ways we can do evangelism. How are we going to do that? We're going to build a building. All right, tell us how we're going to do that. You see, that's the job of the leaders, to point the direction. They have the oversight. They have the vision requirement. Now, they must not allow the urgent and regular routines to keep them from doing the role that only you can do. That's Acts chapter 6, right? When the apostles said no to feeding the Greek widows, we must stay in preaching and prayer. Now, let me kind of break this down practically a little bit. If we think about, there's 7 vision categories, I would call it. There's local evangelism, there's mission work, there's benevolence, there's education, there's physical property, there's discipleship, growing people, and there's youth and family. I put those as 7 areas of the church. Now, here's what I would suggest. We all know foundationally of every church is the Great Commission and Great Commandment. But if you get up and just talk about that every week, people understand that that's the thing. They know that, right? restoration. They understand we want to be the church of the New Testament. But how does that look here? How does that look here? How do we live that out? Now, then there's the general mission, which I would categorize as worship, evangelism, youth, benevolence, discipleship. In most of our congregations, all of this is going to be taking place. And that's going to be going on. And that needs to be constantly a part of our vision. But what I would suggest is that you need to have every 1 to 2 years some focus that this is what we're doing. This is what we're about. Now, that's your now vision. This is what we're doing now. What I found is that in churches that I've worked with, both in all kinds of capacities, if it's kind of like kids. If they don't have something going on, they tend to get in trouble. My kids riding in the back seat where you can, man, you know, we try not to play devices all the time, but, you know, if they get back there and they're just sitting there for very long, I have to constantly remind them, guys, don't touch each other, don't bother each other, don't fuss. You just got to ride, just sit. Because if there's nothing going on, they want to touch. It's like James Dobson says about kids when he kept his grandkids one time. He said, you know, they're not bad kids. They're real rambunctious, but if you kind of keep them out in the open and keep them so busy, they're good. That's how sheep are, right? If churches don't have things going on and it's just the same maintenance, we tend to have gossip, infighting, and conflict. If we have things going on, and so there needs to be, now guys, here's what I would suggest, and you apply this how it best works for you, but you need to be selecting 1 or 2 of these areas every couple years that you're really emphasizing. Now you can't always, and it needs to be made up by your church, and I'll talk about some questions here in a moment. It needs to be made up by your church, but you can't always be emphasizing youth and family. Because if you're always emphasizing them, you're going to neglect your Bible school program, you're going to neglect your evangelism, you're going to neglect these things. But you may say, for a couple years here, we're really going to emphasize and we're going to create a culture where we are accepting and loving and we have an active youth and family program. And that's what we talk about a lot. That's what we share stories about. That's what we share numbers about. That's what we emphasize. And we're going to organize that. We're going to hire a youth minister. We're going to do this right. But if you're still doing that 10 years from now, it's probably a little problem. You see, you got to really focus in on that, but then you got to move on. Now, in my context, back in Mayfield, you know, for several years, I remember one time for a few years, we really focused in on establishing a Hispanic congregation. And for a couple years there was a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, but then it hit maintenance. In that church, we had a Hispanic minister, there was fellowship there, but our focus still couldn't be on that. We had to move on. We had a mission effort we did in El Salvador, and that was a lot of focus. Then we did a building project, and that was a lot of focus. But as long as you have something you're really focusing in on that helps coordinate your overall church, so when people ask the question, what is your church doing? What's your church doing? Well, you don't say, well, our church comes to church at 10 o'clock every Sunday. Well, yeah, every church in the county does that. What's your church doing? Another question I like to ask is, what if your church ceased to exist? Would anybody notice? So, like, what's your favorite restaurant you drive by in Corinth? Like, if you may not like McDonald's, but let's just pick on McDonald's. Let's say you like to get coffee from McDonald's. And so you went by and McDonald's was closed up. They're done. Are you going to miss it? Like, you're going to miss it. Well, is your church making an impact upon your community so that if your church does not exist, people are like, I miss that church there. They really were making an impact. Our church, our community is worse off because they're no longer around. What is it that you're doing that's making an impact? You see, this is what I mean by vision. Like, and who sets this? The shepherds set this. In conjunction with the church, in conjunction with the elder, with the deacons, but the shepherds are the ones who say, this is where we're going to focus our attention. Because as we go through this, what is required to make a vision reality, it's got to be specific. You got to say, this is what we're doing. It's got to be funded, right? It has to have resources and budget behind it. It has to be easily seen. It can't be overly complicated. It can't be intricate. We're going to start a preschool program. We have a lot of families that can, in our community now, that are having kids, a lot of young kids. We're going to start a Tuesday program. We're going to start a preschool program here to reach out to our young people. Easily seen, specific. We got to fund it though, and it has to be talked about. When you hear people in the hallways talking about your vision, you know you're accomplishing something. When they're talking about, hey, this is what our church is doing. I'm excited about that new program. Yeah, so we're really emphasizing youth around here. We're starting up Last to Leaders. We've got this youth program. They're going to CYC. They're doing these things. Hey, I'm excited about what's going on around here. That's when I'm talking about vision. Vision is not just we put up a sign that says love God and love others. Vision is about this is what our congregation is doing. And it's very easy for us to be, I compare it to a raft floating down the river. Church was started, we just get in that raft and we just roll down the river. Wherever the waves take us, we just go. We show up on Sundays and that's just what we do. But the job of a leader is to say, this is where we're going. Now, that needs to be clear in our doctrine. That needs to be clear in our practice. That needs to be clear. Guys, you're not going to win everybody. But you will win more people if they know where you stand. If you guys wanted, a chicken sandwich today, would you go to our favorite burger place is, I just forgot its name, Culver's. Culver's. I don't go to Culver's to get a chicken sandwich. I'll go to Chick-fil-A, right? If you wanted a good burger, would you go to Chick-fil-A? I really want a burger today. I think I'm going to go to Chick-fil-A. No. Why? Because Chick-fil-A sells chicken sandwiches, right? Culver's sells really good burgers. Now, do they hit everybody with burgers? They don't hit everybody because some people want a chicken sandwich. So those people go to Chick-fil-A. But you know when you go to that place what you're getting. When people come to our building, they need to know what they're getting. They need to know what they're getting. They need to clearly know this is what this church is about. This is what they're doing. This is who they are. And then they can decide if they want to be a part of that. And that takes care of so many of our problems when it comes to evangelism, when it comes to our doctrine, when it comes to a lot of things. So there needs to be a vision. Here's some questions. What are the most, and you probably may not be able to write all these down, but I'll get them to you if you want them. What are the most pressing needs in our community? This is to help you figure out what's our vision. What do we need to address? What are the current strengths of our church family? Man, where are we blessed at? What programs or ministries have made the most impact in this church the last 30 years? When I think about this church over the last 30 years, what programs have we really been the most successful with? Like, if we didn't have those programs, we would not be who we were. And maybe we need to reinvigorate those. Maybe we need to bring those back. Maybe we need to... See, churches have personalities. Some churches are better at this than that. Some churches are great at mission work. Other churches are great at education. Other churches are great at evangelism. What are you great at? Lean into your strengths, not your weaknesses. What is our burden? It's our burden. Most of our solutions come from our problems, right? Most of our solutions come from our problems. What are we facing in our community? Man, we've had a rash of people that are dealing with death. What are we doing as a church to address that? We've had a lot of issues with divorce. What are we doing as a church to address that? Where does God want us to do in the next 5 years? Where does God want us to go in the next 5 years? In 5 years, where does God want this church? And then this is a long one, but this is a good one. If we accomplish one thing during the next X months, then in the next 12 months we accomplish one thing, what would it be? In other words, what must be true in the next so many months for us now to be able to look back and say with any credibility we had a good period? That's from business, but it's really a great thought. In other words, what are we focused on here this year? If we're going to be successful this year, what's it going to be? Right? And how do we measure that? And so time spent in clarifying the vision is not time wasted, but essential to the work of an eldership. It will promote the unity, help and understand the role, and avoid future problems. So what would you tell a friend that the church is doing? All right, I want to stop and ask, you guys have any comments, questions, anything about vision or any additions that you want to make to this discussion?
Am I thinking right? You were talking about what's the most difficult, the macro or the micro. I think the micro needs to feed into doing this. And for somebody who's not an elder, this is mysterious to me. It looks mysterious. How do you come up with a vision from what's going on right now?
Well, I think what I'm suggesting is, and you're making a good point, is that you've got to think about these questions.
Yeah.
You've got to think about, why are we here? And what are we about? And what I found is churches will gravitate to that. I worked with the church recently in doing some surveys for them and interviewing some of their members because they were struggling with this issue. And one of the counsels that I gave, and after all that was concluded, I gave the eldership was, these people, they were fearing, as elders often do, that the people didn't really trust them or want to follow them or were lacking in their strength of them because it had a historically strong eldership. A lot of those guys had left because of age, and now they had new eldership. And they were fearing that, I just don't know if they respect us like the other ones. And one of the things that I was able to tell them from the survey and through the interviews is that, no, this church loves you and wants to follow you. They just don't know where you want them to go. And if you will tell them where you want them to go and clarify, because they were on things like Sunday night and other things, they were trying to just do a lot of different stuff. And they were, with children's ministries and different things, they were doing a lot of different things, and they were doing so many things with the shotgun approach that everybody was just kind of like, I don't really know what we're all about. Where's our focus of ministry? That's what I'm talking about. What's our focus of ministry? And I said, if you guys will clarify for them, this is where we're going to put our emphasis. They will trust you and follow you. And I really believe that. Like, that's what people want. And there won't be so much conflict then. There won't be two kids sitting in the back fighting over it, and they won't be arguing about it because there's a direction.
What do you say to congregations that you've worked with or that you've perhaps done these surveys type things with? Is there a portion of that where you talk about how up front or how up in front of the congregation is your eldership? Is your leadership? One of the things that through the time where I've been, I've pushed for, probably, I don't want to say unhealthily, but I've pushed for rather vocally in meetings is, hey, I want you guys up there. I want, if there's a big announcement to be made, don't wait for one of the ministers to make it. You make it.
Yeah.
And show them where you're going and what we're doing, and that you're behind it, because while we can have our finger on the pulse of the congregation, you're the one you're driving.
Yeah.
You're driving the bus. So what would you say to elderships who haven't really had that mentality before as you're trying to, you asked who shepherds the shepherd, and I know that's a kind of a different, you were coming at that from an emotional and a personal standpoint, but how do you do that in a way that doesn't come off as disrespectful?
Well, I think emphasizing this idea that you can never over communicate your vision, and you can never communicate enough with churches, right? Like, you think, I've learned this in teaching at Freed Harmon, guys, that you think you've communicated something because you've said it a couple times. But we all know, the average, it takes like 7 times for people even start to believe it. So you get up, so for example, if you get up and you say, we're going to this year focus on personal evangelism. How many times, and you have the preacher preach a sermon on personal evangelism. That's what I call preacher talk. And there's a saying by Peter Drucker that says that culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. And the idea is your culture of your church is going to interpret that based upon what's happened and what we do. So for most churches, personal evangelism, let's do that. We ought to be doing it. Most people interpret that as, oh yeah, we've heard that before. we should be doing that, but we really don't know how to do it, and that's for the preacher to do. And they go out the door and nothing changes. So if you're really going to change that in your culture and make that, then you're going to have to talk about that every week, and you're going to have to, as the leadership, you're going to have to get involved in personal evangelism, and you're going to have to make that a part of who you are, and then it will trickle down to, as you're having Bible studies, as you're showing film strip videos, as you're inviting your friends and neighbors to church, then the members see that and they say, oh, I guess that is the culture here. I guess we are going to do that here because the elders are really doing it. It's like with the building project. The guys that come in and will help you raise funds for that, they'll tell you that they can look at what the eldership or the lead team is going to give and tell you very closely what the church is going to give based upon just what the leadership's doing. And it's because that's like if there's a division in your church, you can almost generally guess there's a division within the eldership. Because the eldership is a reflection of the church. And the church is going to model the leadership. And they're going to follow them. So I think, it's really encouraging them to let them know that they are central to that vision. And they're the ones who are pushing it. And people follow them and respect them. I think it's often an insecurity we have or a lack of belief that the church really wants to follow us and really trust us. Somebody else have a comment or question before we take a break? All right, guys. So on this, providing care, not going to be able to go through that. I just want to say, know the sheep, heal the sheep, seek the sheep, pray for the sheep. All right, so that's the idea of that micro, and if we had more time, we'd go through that. But the idea that you then, the other aspect of this is prayer for them, visitation, doing what you can, and working together, right? Using text messages. Today, there's the rule I like to give that was told me a long time ago is I call it the 4 H's. The 4 H's. Whenever there's a crisis, whenever there's an issue in your church, that is, you want to hurry. You want to hurry to them, try to make contact with them as fast as you can. You want to, when you get there, you want to hug them. You want to make physical contact, let them know, hey, I care about you. Come. You want to hush. You can't say the perfect thing, so you just try to be quiet. If there's a crisis, there's been a death, something. And then finally, you want to help. Do whatever you can to help. And if you think about it from your church family, whenever there's a crisis, there's someone going through something, your eldership needs to make sure one of the members of the eldership, the minister, somebody from your church family is there. It's kind of like raising kids. You can't always be there. Quantity time matters. But there are also, in the life of a church, there are really impactful, important moments. People really need to see you there at the important times. They don't, in other words, when they have a death in their family, when they have a huge illness, huge announcement in their family, that's when they need to see you. That's when you need to make sure you're there. And it's amazing how people will often be upset, even though you've done all these things. And as a minister even, if you've done all these things, you think you've been there, but if you miss out on those opportunities, it often hurts them in their faith. But the vice versa. If you're there for those big opportunities, they'll be talking about that 10 years from now. Well, I remember Brother so-and-so. He came by when my dad was dying, and the church came by, and the eldership asked us in to pray about it. I remember them doing that. It's been 10 years, but they still remember it. So praying for the sheep, knowing the sheep, involves showing up at the big moments. It really is important. Hug, hush, help, and what was it? Hug, hurry. It's a great advice. And it wasn't for me. All right, guys, let's take let's come back about 11:10. Let's do 11:15. Come back 11:15. We'll have 30 minutes of discussion. So what I'd like to do, guys, is let's gather into groups of, first of all, let's tell you what. First of all, before we break into groups, does anybody have a question from the first session or this session that you're just wanting to ask that we haven't given you time to ask? Anybody have a comment?
A question I have is, as like a perspective, like minister, preacher, how do you balance the like natural like shepherding you do in that role while still like respecting and like not being in the role of like a appointed elder? You know what I mean?
That's a good question.
That.
Well, this is something that is hard and you can struggle with. But if we have elders here, we have deacons here, we have ministers here, we got members here. It's just like a highway out here in Chattanooga or Nashville, right? You got 5 and 6 lane highways. The key is you got to know what lane you're in, and you got to respect those other lanes. And I think if we can all adopt that attitude and realize that everybody's got a lane and a job and a duty. And the women have a job and duty. Different people have jobs and duties. This is Ephesians chapter 4, right? But I don't need to take on, and I have to remind myself this as a minister, I don't need to take on the role of the eldership. That's where they're going to stand accounted for. That's their job. If I'm a deacon, I need to do my job, the best job I can do. Whatever the responsibilities I have, whatever ministry I need to do that the best I can do. But I also don't need to bring any division, any divisiveness, any criticism that is unwarranted toward the elders and divide them. That's their job. And same as the elders. The elders need to allow the deacons to do their job. They need to trust them to do that job. They need to delegate that job to them, and they need to expect them to do it. If they're not doing it, rather than doing it for them, they need to ask them to do it. So the elders got to expect the deacons to do their job. So in other words, stay in your lane. And that will help everybody out so much if we can do that. That'd be my answer. Somebody else may have a better one, but anybody else have a thought on that? All right, let's break into groups then. So this will allow some diversity. I want there to be kind of a mixture in the groups so we can hear from one another. So I'd like to have, we have several young guys up here. So I'm going to split you guys up. I'm going to give you a number between 1 and, let's say we got 2, between 1 and 6. So we have 6 groups, all right? So you'll go, so group 1 will be over here, group 2 here, 3 there, 4 back there, 5 there, and 6 there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So 1 is over to my left where Hunter is. 2 is here. 3 is here. 4 is in the back left corner. 4 is in the back left corner. If you get with the wrong number, then 5 is here in the middle. 6 is over there. All right. So 2s are here. All right. First question, guys. And so I want you to go ask these questions, and I'm going to throw up a couple questions, and y'all just discuss these as a group. And I want you to be able to talk about them. Number 6 lost some, right?
6s are back here.
All right, I'll tell you what we're going to do. You two gentlemen, go with 4 and 5. Y'all split up and go with 4 and 5, so we'll have enough. All right, so the first question is, I want you to discuss, based upon our 5 challenges or anything else you want to add, what do you feel is the most challenging aspect regarding the family in shepherding? And this comes from your perspective, all right? So what do you think is the most challenging? So talk about that question for a few minutes, and then we'll go to another question. No, your personal family. From that first lecture. We talked about wives, kids, isolation, stress, time. the fishbowl complex, just anything in there that you think is most challenging.
Let's talk about that.
All right, I'm going to go on. Y'all finish that discussion if you need to. The next question is, how do you anticipate the leadership affecting your wife or bringing challenges to your marriage? So if you are an elder, you can speak to that. If you're thinking about becoming an elder or might be one in the next 40, 50 years, how do you think that might be a challenge upon your marriage or upon your wife? I'm just listening. All right, I'm going to change question, guys. Y'all keep talking about that if you want. The next question is, what most intimidates you about becoming a shepherd? So if you're finished with that one, move on to this one. What most intimidates you about becoming a shepherd? Or if you are one, what's most challenging?
society are more intimidated by doing like personal visits or going to hospitals. Other guys are more intimidated by working with other men in a room. So for you, what do you find the most challenging aspect of the work that we've talked about? makes you nervous. So when you think about making a visit with someone, what have you found helpful to do that? How do you go about it? Do you call before? You know, how does that work for you, your life and your church's life? Think about that for a few minutes. several, but you can't really hit all these. But I want you just to think about vision, and you can just talk about, does your church have a vision? Share that idea. And where do y'all think your church should be going? Like, just discuss vision for a little bit. There's some questions that can kind of help you. I just want you to talk about vision. We got about 5 minutes left, and so then we'll do go to lunch.